Merci Chuck, merci Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Et permettez-moi de dire que c'est pour moi un véritable plaisir de me trouver dans la capitale d'une nation libre et prospère et conservatrice. Believe me, my friends, that's not something you get the chance to say very often in the European Union where I come from. And certainly not in French. You know, Chuck and I and the Ambassador, we're all ex-politicians. We were swapping campaign stories as we do on these occasions. There is nothing like an election campaign to remind the elected politician of the full diversity of wildlife that he represents in his constituency. We had an election last year in Britain. I knocked on a door canvassing in a town in my constituency called Woking, and it was answered by a little boy who must have been all of about 5, 6 years old. And he was wearing an enormous velvet smoking jacket, hanging loosely from his little shoulders. In one hand, he was swirling an enormous balloon of brandy, about the size of his little head. And in the other hand, smouldering slowly ceilingwards, was this great sausage-sized Cuban cigar. Well, as you do when you're canvassing, I leaned down, I said, "Are your parents at home?" And he said, "Does it effing look as though my parents are at home?" So, believe me, my friends, when I tell you, it is such a pleasure to be in a place where nobody can vote for me. You know, this is, or against me. I can see a number of elected representatives in the room. This is a home game for you guys, but this is an away game for me. But you know, although I may be a neutral here, I'm not disinterested. And no Briton can be disinterested about the politics of Canada. We've been through too much together. You're too close to us. And so I hope you will allow me to presume a little on our kinship and say a word or two about your present political situation and indeed about this conference. I've noticed in the last 48 hours, both on this stage and in the corridors around, that people have been doing exactly what the Conservative movement should be doing, which is to pick holes in what the Conservative government is doing. And that's great. You're the people who ought to be doing that, right? That's your job. That's what the broader movement is for. But don't lose sight of the big picture. Of all the major economies in the world, Canada's is the only one to have come through the recent crash without this explosion in debt and tax and spending. And that didn't just happen by accident. It's very natural when you're close to something that you focus on the things that you don't like. You know, I remember I was a schoolboy and then a student when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. And that's what I did. It's what we all did. Oh, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the Single European Act. I can now see, with the perspective of time, something that I can perhaps see with the perspective of distance about contemporary Canada. We didn't know how lucky we were. Don't lose the big picture. They say no man is a hero to his valet, right? If you're standing very close to somebody, silver screen star, you see that there's makeup and it may not be put on perfectly. But you know, looking from where I'm standing, I see this country led by a government of patriots who have restored prosperity and pride, and led by a Prime Minister who is a statesman of the first rank. And I wish we had someone like him on our side of the Atlantic. You know, I hope you don't mind I say those things, but I don't really feel I'm among strangers here. It's one of those bizarre accidents of history and geography. My constituency is 22 miles from Europe, but I would never presume to tell a continental audience about their own internal politics. I feel, as Abraham says in the good book, I feel that I'm a stranger and a sojourner among them. I don't feel that when I come here. We may be sundered by thousands of miles. Canada is a different country, a sovereign country, a separate country, but it's not for us really a foreign country. And that's why I hope you don't mind if I talk a little bit about what's happening in Canada and about what's happening in the wider Anglosphere. I want to make a point that perhaps has been made before from this podium but can't be said too often. This government, this Conservative government that you enjoy now, didn't happen in a vacuum. There was a change in the political climate that made it possible. And the man who most effected that change is Preston Manning. And it's a real privilege for me to be able to stand in this room and say this. He was a great hero of mine when I was a student, but I don't want to build him up as some kind of John the Baptist figure who just prepared the way for somebody else. He taught me something hugely important, which has been a lesson that stuck with me all the way through my time in elected politics, which is that you don't have to be wielding the levers of power in order to change your country. Simply by leading the opposition as he did, Preston put a country that was on the wrong course back on the right track. That's the power of conviction and principle and selflessness and leadership. And that's a lesson that I think all of us can learn from. So it's a huge privilege to be able to say that here. And it's a huge privilege to be able to welcome Canada back to the Anglosphere. You know, I was born in the kind of Trudeau years. And all the time that I was growing up, Canada was seen abroad as a kind of outpost of continental Europe in North America. Right? Conrad Black, my old boss, used to say, we're English-speaking Scandinavians, we Canadians, right? And I could see what he meant, both in terms of foreign policy and in terms of domestic policy. And it's perhaps only now that we've got to the end of that period, that we've got to a restoration of conservative principles here, that you can see quite what an aberration it was. You know, up until then, this country was defined by its self-reliance, its independence, its freedom. An enormous territory like this isn't settled by people, you know, whose main preoccupations are a nationalized healthcare system and the supremacy of the United Nations. And we of all people are delighted to see Canada back. The first time that Stephen Harper crossed my radar was his first trip abroad when he was leading the minority, his first foreign speech, I think, even as Prime Minister, when he was passing through London on his way to a G7 summit in St. Petersburg. And he made a beautiful and touching speech about the importance of the common law and parliamentary tradition as the basis of Canada's freedom. Now, as a matter of historical record, it was pretty uncontroversial. If he'd been speaking to a seminar of academic historians, it wouldn't have been an especially exciting thing to say. It was a rather obvious point. But, you know, what a change from what we'd had up until then, which was Canada as this happy multi-culti fusion of indigenous peoples and Acadians and illegal immigrants. You know, it was... And I thought, welcome back, and of all people, we have cause to be grateful to have you back. You know, in the First World War, 70,000 Canadians died at Vimy Ridge, at Passchendaele, and at the Somme. Of a population of 7 million, 70,000 fatalities. Another 45,000 in the Second World War. All for the sake of a country which, in most cases, they'd never set eyes on. So believe me when I say, no Briton can be disinterested about your politics. The sturdy common sense here of a patriotic people has now imposed itself on the preoccupations of a bien-pensant elite. The same has not happened in my country. You have convincingly rejoined the Anglosphere. We are still wrenched from our natural orbit and attached to the European Union. You've escaped your Trudopia. We are still stuck in Europe. And only now, perhaps, does the full implication of what our fathers did in the 1970s become clear. You know, when we joined the EU, most British people saw it as a kind of trade-off between the politics and the economics. All right, we'd be losing a little bit of sovereignty, that was a bad thing, but in exchange we'd be getting access to this great common market, right? Nobody looking across the channel today still makes that equation. We see what's happening on the continent, and we understand that European integration means the destruction of our democracy and the destruction of our prosperity. This is not something that's just been caused by the euro crisis. It's been decades since you could find any opinion poll in Britain suggesting that people would vote to remain